Environmental defenders the world over are fighting to protect their lands and communities, often at high risk. Hosted by Inspire Dialogue Foundation and Global Witness, we feature 3 such stories. From Mexico, where an environmental law center supports the rights of indigenous peoples. In the Philippines, where this human rights lawyer, himself knifed by assailants earlier this year, defends protesters of mega government projects. And from South Africa, a young woman tells us about her mother, who campaigned against the extension of an open-pit coal mine and was murdered by 3 unknown men in her own home in October 2020. These are their stories. And now, here's our host, Inspire Dialogue Foundation trustee and former Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Rowan Williams.
Welcome to this dialogue on climate justice and the roots of conflict. My name is Rowan Williams, and I'm very grateful indeed to those who've been organizing the People's Summit for Climate Justice around the COP26 meeting for giving us this opportunity for raising a set of issues which urgently need addressing, issues from the grassroots of the climate justice struggle. We're all familiar enough with the broad pictures of the climate situation, the crisis that we currently face. We're all aware in various ways of the huge imbalance of risk, insecurity, and suffering that the climate crisis means. The fact that those least able to cope with the privation and challenge of climate change are bearing the heaviest cost. But we can sometimes forget that the bearing of that cost is for some people far more direct, far more risky than it is for most. We're going today to hear particularly from the experience of climate defenders, activists in the front line, those who've been alongside people risking their lives in the struggle for climate justice. And their experience, their stories, are a powerful and disturbing reminder to all of us that if we're going to talk about climate justice, we have to talk about 2 other things as well. We need to talk about the roots of violence. Where does the savagery come from that resists activism around climate change? And so we're also going to have to talk about power, where it lies and how it is exercised. And so it's with that broad agenda in mind that I invite you to share in this conversation today. And I'll hand over at this point to Seema Joshi, who is the Director of Campaigns at Global Witness. Seema, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Rowan. It's such a pleasure to be on this panel with you today, as well as these 3 very brave land and environmental defenders. Before I introduce our defenders, I wanted to take a few moments to just introduce Global Witness, which is the organization I'm working for, as well as set the stage about the threats, the violence, the harm that really land and environmental defenders are facing today. My name is Seema Joshi. I'm the Director of Campaigns for Global Witness. Global Witness is a campaigning organization that was first formed in 1993. Our aim is to challenge abuses of power, to protect human rights, and to secure the future of our planet. In terms of our land and environmental defenders work, we specifically prioritize working with communities, grassroots activists, and frontline defenders in the worst affected areas. For nearly a decade now, Global Witness has been recording attacks against land and environmental defenders. These are the people who are standing up for their land, for our planet, against exploitative industries and the climate breakdown. We've been tracking killings like the assassination of Fikil Nashangase and of the 9 Tumunduk community members last year. It's been clear for a long time that governments need to take action to protect defenders. And at this COP, the moment is now, and it is imperative. In the past decade, we've seen a grim trend emerge. As the climate crisis has intensified, so has the violence against defenders of the earth. The same forces that are felling trees, pulling minerals out of the ground, and polluting our water and air are causing violence against individuals and communities that are fighting for their land and our planet. Last year, in 2020, Global Witness issued our most recent annual report, which documented killings across the world. And unfortunately, the number is even higher than it has been in the last years preceding that. We recorded 227 killings. This is a terrible and worst case scenario, but in addition to these killings, we have harm, violence, criminalization, all of these other very dangerous threats that are not even being recorded. And it's very important to keep that in mind. Over a third of the attacks that we recorded last year were linked to natural resource exploitation. This includes logging, mining, and large-scale agribusiness, and hydroelectric dams and other infrastructure. We also continue to see a disproportionate number of attacks against Indigenous peoples, with over a third of all fatal attacks against Indigenous peoples and communities. Between 2012 and 2020, Global Witness has recorded 1,539 land and environmental defenders being killed. Concerted international action and strong legislation is required to ensure that companies act responsibly. And this type of legislation will go a long way to ensuring that defenders are in fact safe. With that, I would like to now introduce the three really brave defenders that we have joining us today. I would like to start with Margarita Campuzano. Margarita is a Mexican campaigner and the Director of Communications at SEMDA, a Mexican climate group. For nearly 3 decades, this organization has worked to ensure that environmental laws are enforced and strengthened for the benefit of all Mexican civilians. Margarita, please.
Thank you very much. Very nice to meet you. Thank you very much for this opportunity. And well, I would like to begin by saying that, as you were already explaining, in Mexico, also the violence against environmental defenders is a structural and systematic problem for decades. And unfortunately, neither this government, the current government, but nor past governments have been able to stop it. My organization, SEMDA, has been working on this report also for 8 years now, recording also aggressions specifically in Mexico against environmental defenders. Last year, 2020, we recorded 18 murders and 90 aggressions from different kinds that go from threats, kidnapping, criminalization, physical violence, and even murder against indigenous and rural communities mainly. And in this 2021, we have recorded so far 13 killings. It's important to say that main aggressions against these people are linked or were linked in 2020 to the roads construction sector, mining, and illegal logging. And this is a clear consequence of the global predatory and extractivist development model, which also has a great deal to do with climate change, as you are already saying. In Mexico, we have an additional problem that it's the impunity of these cases. It's almost 90%. I mean, we do not have the chance to track or to follow up the cases. We just record them. We don't know which ones are solved, which ones are being sanctioned, but we have like a general perspective that almost all of them are going without sanction, without anybody going to jail for this situation. And well, we, as you were saying, my organization is giving legal advisory to people who cannot afford a legal office or legal to hire lawyers to build cases against mega projects that are affecting their lands, their natural resources, and even their cultural heritage. To mention just an example, a quick example to begin, we are currently providing legal assistance to Mayan communities in the Yucatan Peninsula who are challenging a federal government named Mayan Train. And the reasons to challenge this project are basically two. One is the environmental impact of the project, who will deforest hundreds of hectares of the second largest tropical forest in America after the Amazon, which is the Calakmul forest or the Calakmul Reserve. This is also a world natural heritage and a world cultural heritage. The second reason is because according to international treaties, like, for example, the Agreement 169 of the International Labour Organization and national legislation too, indigenous communities in Mexico have to be consulted, seeking to obtain their consent when projects that affect them are carried out. And in this case, the communities are alleging that they were never appropriately consulted if they want the train to pass by near their communities or near where they live, because also many people from there are being displaced from the historic territories they're living in, because now the railroads or the train are passing by. And I will just conclude saying that Mexico is the 5th country with more biodiversity in the world. So the economic and political interests are putting a lot of pressure against the environment and the people that the clear impact on global climate change. So I will leave it here for the moment, and thank you very much again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Margarita, for making those excellent points. I will now turn to A.K. Gillen, just as a bit of an introduction. A.K. Gillen is a Filipino human rights lawyer and counsel to the Tumandok, an indigenous community who were the victim of a massacre in 2020 where 9 people died following their opposition to a mega dam. Mr. Gillen himself has also been injured in an attack in March 2021. Thank you so much for being with us, AK. The floor is yours.
Thank you for having me. And as discussed in the Global Witness Report, 29 environmental activists in the Philippines have been killed in the last year, 2020. We would like to point out that they are among the more than 400 activists who have been killed under the administration of President Rodrigo Duterte. And in the midst of these attacks, the Philippine government continues to promote policies and activities harmful to the environment. And this include the large-scale mining, deforestation, the construction of mega dams, land conversion for the purpose of real estate and infrastructure projects, and of course the use of pesticides, herbicides, and genetically modified crops. Now, among the priority projects of the Philippine government are the construction of 8 large dams and reservoirs intended to increase water capacity or water supply for the country's urban areas. So among these mega dams is the Halaor Dam in Panay Island, where the site of the Tumandok massacre took place in December of last year. Now, these dams are being built on the ancestral land of indigenous communities like the Tumandok and Panay Island. Other dams are also being built in other parts of the country. These are being built on ancestral lands of other indigenous communities like the Aita, the Dumagat, and the Remontado in Luzon. Now, this means that under Philippine law, the construction of these dams can proceed only if the affected communities freely give their consent after they have been made aware of the impact of these projects. Of course, the impact would include the destruction of forest land, the disruption of the natural flow of the rivers, the destruction of the ecosystem and their source of food and livelihood, and the flooding of entire communities of indigenous peoples. Unfortunately, the Philippine government does not even follow its own laws. They do not consult indigenous communities or involve them in negotiations. They do not properly explain the adverse consequences of these projects. The Philippine government uses the military and other government agencies to threaten, bribe, to deceive locals into signing away their rights to their ancestral lands. And if the indigenous communities refuse to give their consent, they become the targets of military operations. Soldiers are deployed to their communities. The military restricts or monitors their movements. The Philippine Air Force bombs their communities, and schools that have been built by private organizations for these indigenous communities are being closed down, sometimes being destroyed. And of course, the worst atrocities take the form of massacres, and summary executions, just like what happened to the Tumandok in December of last year. But that is not even the latest massacre that took place. Only in June of this year, a special forces unit massacred 3 members of the Lumad Manobo tribe in Mindanao. They killed and even mutilated the bodies of the victims, one of whom was a 12-year-old girl. And these human rights violations and the policies that are adversely affecting the environment are able to take place, especially under this administration, because the bureaucracy of the Philippine government has to a large extent been militarized. The departments that are implementing environmental policies are headed by former generals, members of the police and the military who have retired and were then appointed by President Duterte to head these departments. I'm talking about the department dealing with the environment, indigenous people, irrigation, and water resources. So it's a very dire situation, and it is certainly a challenge to get the message to the world and to other countries that these things are happening in the Philippines. So thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to discussing this further.
Thank you very much, Ike, for sharing that shocking information and to that level of detail. Next, I would like to introduce Malungo Shakaza. Malungo is a South African activist and the daughter of Fikio Nashangase, an anti-coal campaigner assassinated last year. Malungo is continuing the campaign against the mine and pursuing accountability for her mother's killing. She comes from an area in South Africa, KwaZulu-Natal province, and we're really pleased to have you here today. Thank you so much, Mangulo.
Thank you for inviting me. Yes, I come from a rural area in KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, Mtuba and Opondweni. That's the name of our village, Opondweni. We live in an area where we were told that there's going to be a mine coming into our area, which we felt was great news. And little did we know that the community or the villagers will not be as important when decisions were being made about their land. And my mom, as one of the community members, felt that she would to stand up for their rights, because people were being cheated on the amount of money they should be getting. Their rights were even violated. No one was listening to them. Negotiations, as it should be done, were not being held between the community members and the mine, and even the government and the chieftaincy of the area. And she felt that people couldn't just up and move and leave their land just like that, just because they've been promised jobs or they've been promised money. We've had cows, livestock dying because the trucks hit the cows. We've also had livestock eating dirty grass because of the dust that's been blown from the mine. So my mom's fear was that how much more worse could things get if the mine is closer to us, because they were bringing in a proposal of having the mine closer to our village. So those are the things that really, really worried her, besides the money that people were going to get. But she was worried about, are they the people's rights? And she felt that a whole lot of good things were being dangled in front of our villagers, but not a whole lot of truth was being told. And it's still happening. People are still being promised that should they sign over their land, good will happen, good will come. We haven't seen any good coming though. The villagers are more in fear. I think after what happened to my mom, I think if they would come to a person's house and say, here's the papers, sign your land over or else, they would know what they mean by saying or else. I think what happened to my mom left fear, a whole lot of fear in the community, because she was one of those people who would stand up in the meeting and say what she felt and what she could quote even from our constitution. And she was one of those people who would stand up in the meeting and say what she felt and what she could quote even from our constitution. So as a community, let's all rise together and try and get the mining industry to learn to negotiate with the community, because it's not like we're saying no to the mining industry. We're just saying no to them treating and violating people's rights. They should follow procedure. They should, whatever they bring to the community will be good, but they should follow the right procedures so that no one is getting harmed or no one is feeling inferior or no one is feeling more superior than the other. We are a community. We all need each other. They need us as a company. We also need them as a village, because we lack some resources as a village. So it will be good if both parties or all three parties would sit down and talk and reach an understanding. I hope and pray that someday this is all resolved and people stop killing each other.
I want to say a very heartfelt thank you to our speakers today, who have all of them opened up some very raw places, some very difficult stories to listen to, some very painful memories. And what has struck me most in listening to these stories is a couple of the themes that come through in all of them. One, perhaps the most obvious, is the question of accountability. How do we hold companies and businesses properly accountable for what they do? How and in what sense are they accountable to the local communities on which, in a sense, they depend for their very existence? But it's not just a question about the accountability of companies. As we've heard, there are unaccountable governments that cannot be relied upon to protect their own people. And there's a real question about how we react to that globally. But the second thing that comes into focus here is, again, a theme that has been common to several of the stories. Indigenous peoples are very particularly at risk in all this. And just as in the global picture, the climate crisis has made clearer to us what kinds of inequality there are around, so in a very special sense, when we're talking about violence against climate defenders, the vulnerability of indigenous communities comes to the fore. These are communities already facing disadvantage, discrimination, and oppression. And this simply brings it more into the light. And it's not simply that we're talking about indigenous communities in the sense of identifiable ethnic groups, but simply local communities who have no redress against decisions made elsewhere. All of that is to say that the climate crisis is, among other things, a question about the future of democracy. It's obviously a question about the future of the human race, but it's very specifically a question of how power is shared and how power is understood, and so about democracy. And I wonder if I could turn perhaps first to AK and ask for his further reflections on how it is that indigenous peoples already begin with a disadvantage in this difficult situation.
In the case of the Philippines, the problem lies not merely in the absence of or the insufficiency of laws that are there to protect them, because to be frank about it, there are actually laws that are in place for the protection of indigenous communities. The main problem is with respect to the implementation of these laws. For example, in the case of the Tumandok, the government acknowledges that the project will result in the loss of ancestral land. It acknowledges that it will result in the emission of greenhouse gases. It acknowledges that thousands of families would be affected and villages would be submerged by the construction of these dams. However, the laws that are in place to ensure that they are involved in the negotiations, they are involved in the creation of safeguards for the protection of their cultures, to ensure that they are protected from possible human rights violations that may be committed against their communities. These laws are not being followed. And what is worse is that these laws are being violated by the government itself, primarily by security forces that have been deployed to these areas in order to quash or to destroy their will to resist development aggression. The big problem when it comes to human rights in the Philippines is that even if these are committed by units of security forces, the police and the military, and even if we know who perpetrated these atrocities, nobody is held into account. The justice system is not working. People are not being prosecuted. Those who are responsible are not being prosecuted. And even if they are being prosecuted, to a large extent, none of the cases succeed in court because many of the agencies of government refuse to exhaust all the means available to hold perpetrators to account. So that is really the gist of the human rights situation confronting environmental defenders in the Philippines.
Thank you very much, AK. I wonder, Margarita, can I turn to you at this point? Do you think that there are adequate legal safeguards for indigenous peoples in your area that are not implemented, or are they just not there in the first place?
Yeah, thank you, Rowan. Yes, well, in Mexico, indigenous people, as you were saying, has been experienced or has been placed in a situation of disadvantage for centuries. They have this double complication that they are in poverty and they are victims of racism. In Mexico, we have a lot of racism. They try not to talk about it, but it's a real problem here. And so this is in one hand. In the other hand, we have the problem that a lot of indigenous and rural communities own the land. In Mexico, these people can be owners of the forests, and actually it works very well in Mexico in that sense because they are also protecting. I mean, the great labor that it's been done in the world by protecting our natural resources, our forests, our rivers, is being done by these people because they have lived there for centuries and they feel this land as the place where their ancestors have lived, and they take care of it. But when there is a project to build any mega project in the area, saying a highway or a hotel or a dam or any of that, it comes a confrontation because they are the owners of the land, but they are displaced. They don't receive correct payment for the lands, and sometimes they just don't want to leave, and they force them to leave. So it's a very, very complicated, as AK was saying, in Mexico, these crimes and these situations are not prosecuted either. So we have that problem. And I just want to finish by saying that also in Mexico, to be an indigenous, but to be a woman is another disadvantage, because if indigenous people are suffering, women are suffering more, because also they have this problem with machismo and all the social, problems in their own communities, and they do not receive proper protection from the state either.
Thank you, Margarita. I'd like to come back in a moment to that question of the role of women here, but maybe I could come back to Lulu for a moment, because you shared with us a truly appalling and very traumatic story, and you've shared it very courageously. The situation in South Africa is clearly not quite the same as the others we've heard described, but the issue of impunity is obviously one that is a real challenge there. And if I heard you rightly, you were saying that one of the effects of these appalling killings was a breakdown of trust in the systems that were supposed to keep you safe.
Well, in our area, in Okondweni, there are certain laws that are meant to protect, or should I say, the Constitution. As we all know that South Africa, they have a Constitution. But when it comes to land issues, the people who are given the land or the people who are already living on that land are then forced to go back and beg again the chieftaincy. Should there be a project, then they are told that this is not your land. If the land belongs to the chief, you cannot take decisions or make decisions around that area. You cannot tell us how we should handle negotiations between you and the project that is coming there. So we end up having our social rights or human rights destroyed by that, because you grow up in the area knowing that this is your mother or your father's land. Whatever decision that should be taken about the land should be negotiated with you or your parents. And then when certain projects or companies come over, then that right is no longer exercised. Then it's just the chieftaincy or the king or whoever they feel, the tribal houses, it's their decisions to make whether to start mining there or to start with that project in a certain area. So whenever there's a person who tries to show that our rights are being violated, that's when the problem starts. With my mom, let me just go back to that part. With my mom, she was one of those people who said, I don't care what's going to happen. My people need me. I'm going to be that person. So even if there were women who were going to come and share with her that information or try to even engage in that and say, yes, we are behind you. After what happened to her, I doubt there will be any woman doing that. Even the men in our society are scared right now because they're like, I don't want to be a victim too.
Thank you so much. But what you've said, of course, and what everyone has said has really reinforced the perception that what we're looking at here is the coming together of a number of problems focused on the climate issue. That is the role of women and the vulnerability of women, issues about land ownership and how that is defended, clarified, how justice is done, issues of accountability at local and at governmental level, all of them bound in together. So that to be committed to climate justice has to be being committed to a whole lot of other things as well. And Margarita, can I come back to you and ask about how what you might call the mainstream political agenda of your country deals with this, whether there's a recognition of that deep interconnectedness of all these issues of justice together?
Yes, well, we have Mexico has an international role of being recognized as a leader in climate change activities, but specifically regarding mitigation goals, for example, mitigation of greenhouse emissions and all that. But in terms of, also last year in the last COP, the country also received a recognition for its work on women, on climate justice for women. And then it's very good. I mean, it's important that our country recognizes that. Unfortunately, this government does not believe very much in climate change either, and they are betting again in fuel fossils, and they are putting a lot of budget in refineries. And this is we are going back in that sense a little bit. And also in terms of what is happening on the grassroots, as you were saying, I think there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of things that have to be recognized. It will have to, in the first place, they will have to admit that they are not being able to solve these problems, to give these people the protection they need. Many of these people we work with, they told us, I didn't know I was an environmental defender. I just live here, I protect my river, this is my home, but when they explained to me that I am an environmental defender and I have rights to do this job and that I have the right to be protected to do this job, it's wonderful because they acquire this conscience and they know that they are entitled to be protected and to have their constitutional rights protected on that sense.
Lulu, it sounds as though the same is true in South Africa, that there are statements made at governmental level, promises and commitments which bear very little relation to what happens at the grassroots. Is that true?
Yeah, yes, it's very true. Our stories are almost similar with our countries, Margarita. We have government people, they will come to meetings, they will promise people negotiations, they will promise people that their rights will not be violated, they will promise people that there will be, especially after my mom's murder, we were promised in the community that we will have police circulating the area every day, every morning, every night. But it only happened for 3 days. At that time, I needed to ask, why aren't the police vans that we were promised that will come and circulate the area? But then no one was there to pick up my call. No one was there to answer me. I think we need to find a way to bridge that gap, because when I said that there used to be meetings between the government officials and the community, what would end up being said would be, we've taken too many questions from the community members. We'd like to wrap up the meeting now because we need to speak to the chieftaincy and just the government officials. We keep pushing. I'm glad to see other people here working through the same thing in their countries. It gives me hope that maybe if we join forces, a whole lot of good might come out of it. So I too have gained confidence in what she was doing, and that's why I would also love to continue in her legacy, because I never knew how much noise she actually made by standing up for just her community. But now, after this, I kind of understand, and thank you, guys. Thank you for being here. It means a lot to me. It gives me more courage to carry on with the fight.
Thank you so much. AK, just one final comment, because I think we're going to have to wrap up the discussion in a moment. Government of the Philippines, you might say, makes no pretense at public commitment to environmental protection. What sort of international pressures are most effective, do you think, in keeping all the governments we've heard about, keeping this issue on their radar? Is there something that the international community can really prioritize here?
Yes, it's really a matter of keeping the different countries aware of the continuing situation in the Philippines, and also maintaining a strong campaign for environmental rights and human rights, not just in the Philippines, but in other countries as well. Well, there is a significant change in the attitude of government when it comes to environmental rights and human rights, because when the president says things that are outrageous about human rights, when he says he does not respect human rights organizations, does not respect the opinion of the international community, that is not just rhetoric. That has an effect on the military, on the police, and government agencies, because they refuse to deal with us once the president has laid down a certain tone or a certain policy when it comes to human rights. And that results in the lack of transparency. We are not able to defend our clients properly because the police and the military refuse to work with us. In fact, they treat us as rebels, supporters of rebel organizations. That also has an effect on the bureaucracy, because they take their orders and they take their attitude, they take the attitude of the president towards our cases. And then that results in the lack of interest when it comes to the prosecution of human rights violations, the investigation of human rights violations. So for us, it is the responsibility as well of the international community to put as much pressure as possible on the current administration and any succeeding administration that may come, because these attacks will continue. And fortunately, one of those developments has taken place in the form of a case before the International Criminal Court, but that only deals with the war on drugs. It does not even deal with attacks against environmental activists. So we are hoping that the international community would continue receiving complaints and would continue hearing us when it comes to these issues, and would continue pressuring the government to cooperate and to bring an end to the impunity and the climate of fear that the administration has certainly brought.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to all our participants who have shared painful and difficult and really important experiences and insights with us. Before we conclude, though, Seema, is there anything you'd like to add to what we've heard so far?
Thank you, Rowan. I just wanted to add that for me, it's really important what Mulengo said about joining forces, and the role of companies in particular, for me, just shouldn't be overlooked, because it makes me angry that we're still in this situation where people are dying and people are being harmed, and there's this sense of that we don't have any power. What can we do? And what we need to have is definitely more accountability, but the power imbalance that you referenced, Rowan, we need to have this shift of power, and that has to be done through accountable measures. And for businesses and for companies that operate across borders, and our supply chains, all of these mining companies, these coal companies, a lot of them, they're supplying across borders. And it's actually other countries, such as, the UK or in Europe, that are benefiting ultimately from the supply chains and from the final products that are made from these goods. And that is the reason why one of the tools we're focusing on, they are laws that focus on supply chains and focuses on the company's conduct in the supply chains, and which pushes companies to undertake preventative actions, because there's so much evidence that companies are failing to take any of the actions. I hope that just last week, the UN Human Rights Council recognized the right to a clean environment as a human right. And my hope is with that, we are actually moving in the direction where we can also use that as a shift in power, so that this can actually empower Indigenous communities and other groups to really make their case that this is the environment, this is our human right to this type of clean environment. And actually, when companies, in collusion with governments, are actually coming in to make profit and prioritize that over their rights, this is a problem, and they will be held to account. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Seema. You've reminded us, Sarah, I think, that we do all have some influence in this. We all in the more developed world, so-called, we all have consumer power. We all have a degree of democratic influence. We have a degree of influence on our own governments. We don't simply have to sit back and wring our hands about this. We need to speak to our own governments about their accountability for what happens elsewhere, their complicity in the human rights disasters that we hear about. And that's something which ought to be very much at the top of the list for all those of us in places like the UK and the US who have a voice. We've been hearing today from those who, for the most part, have not had a voice. Rural communities, indigenous communities, disadvantaged communities, whose voice is overridden by powerful vested interests, whether corporate or governmental or both. And speaking on behalf of the Inspire Dialogue Foundation, it seems to me crucial to recognize that we can't have anything approaching meaningful dialogue if we don't have all voices clearly and safely audible around a table. Malungelo has spoken movingly about how easy it is in some circumstances to silence the voices of protest by threat and violence because of the obvious atrocity that menaces people. And yet those voices are still raised. People are courageous enough to speak out. We want to celebrate their courage, but we also want to make people know that if they do speak out, they will be heard and supported globally. And that's why I think in the context of the People's Summit for Climate Justice, the stories we've heard are crucial bits of our agenda. Climate justice is about all these things. It's not simply about high-level changes. It's certainly not about high-level promises that can't ever really be realized. It's about the transformation of power and access to power. It's about justice. It's about the role of women and justice and security for women at the local level. It's about a transformational view of what human society might be. And perhaps one thing we might take away from this conversation and reflect on is the fact that if we forget our responsibility to the environment, then sooner or later, we forget our responsibility to our fellow human beings. These two are deeply connected. Violence and exploitation towards the environment seems to go hand in hand with violent and exploitative attitudes to other human beings. If we want to change one, we have to change the other. So I hope that today's conversation will have strengthened our resolve to see those connections, to make sure that we're working for transformation on all those fronts. Thank you again to our participants. Thank you for all that they do. Thank you to Global Witness for their global witness and for bringing together the impressive voices that we've heard. And thanks to all those who have listened and shared this very moving conversation. Thank you.